The house seemed too big for just the two of them now. Every creak of the wooden floors, every rustle of curtains in the night felt like a reminder of what was missing. It had been 3 months since Anna's funeral, and yet her presence lingered in every corner as though she had only stepped out for a moment and would walk back in any second, wiping her hands on her apron, smiling the tired, patient smile she always carried. David tried to convince himself that the silence was just something he'd eventually get used to, but each evening when he came home from work, the silence hit him like a wave. He would set his briefcase down, loosen his tie, and pause in the hallway where Anna used to greet him. He half expected to hear her voice, bright and gentle, asking how his day had gone. Instead, there was only the muffled hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, and the distant sound of traffic outside. Michael was his anchor. At 6 years old, the boy was resilient in ways David envied. He seemed to bounce between grief and acceptance with the strange elasticity of children, asking questions about death one day and then talking about dinosaurs the next as if the world hadn't shifted under their feet. But David knew better. He could see it in the way Michael sometimes lingered in the kitchen doorway, staring at the empty chair where Anna used to sit, or the way he clutched his bear a little tighter during bedtime. That particular night, David found himself running late again. He had promised Michael spaghetti, but after the long hours at the office and the endless emails, he barely managed to boil some pasta and heat up sauce from a jar. Michael ate quietly, his small fork scraping against the plate. The boy's legs dangled from the dining chair, swinging back and forth in restless rhythm. David tried to make conversation, but his words fell flat. It was always easier when Anna had been there. She had known how to fill silence with lightness, how to draw their son into laughter. Now the house felt heavy with everything unsaid. When dinner was over, Michael trailed behind David as he carried the dishes to the sink. He insisted on helping, standing on tiptoe to place his plate carefully onto the counter. David felt a pang in his chest. Anna had always said that teaching him small chores would give him responsibility. David wiped his hands on a towel and crouched down to meet his son's gaze. "Bedtime, champ," he said softly. "We've got a big day tomorrow." Michael didn't protest, though his eyes flickered toward the kitchen before turning back to his father. David carried him to his room, tucked him beneath the blanket, and smoothed his hair the way Anna used to do. The boy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes tracing the patterns on the ceiling. Then, in a voice so small it almost disappeared into the dark, he asked, "Daddy, do you miss Mommy?" The question lodged in David's throat like a stone. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Every day, buddy. Every single day." Michael hesitated, pressing his cheek against the bear he held tight to his chest. His next words came out in a whisper. "She comes sometimes. When you're sleeping. I hear her in the kitchen." David froze, staring down at his son. His instinct was to dismiss it, to smooth it over with logic and reassurance, but there was something in the way Michael said it, not a dreamy wonder, but a quiet certainty. David forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dreams, Mikey. That's all. Mommy's in your heart now. Sometimes when you're very tired, your mind makes it feel like she's here. That's what you hear." Michael nodded, though his grip on the bear tightened, and his little brow furrowed as though he wasn't convinced. David kissed his forehead, turned off the light, and left the door cracked the way his son liked. He lingered in the hallway for a moment, listening. The house groaned as it settled, a familiar, weary sound he had heard countless times before. He shook his head, muttering to himself, and went to the living room. The couch had become his bed more often than not. He told himself it was because of late-night work, but in truth, he couldn't bring himself to lie down in the bed he had once shared with Anna. It felt too big, too empty, too cold. He sank into the worn cushions, tugged a blanket over his shoulders, and stared at the ceiling until his eyes grew heavy. At some point, in the blur between waking and sleep, he heard it. A faint clinking, delicate and rhythmic, like plates being stacked. The gentle sound of water running in the sink. His eyes opened wide, his breath catching. For a moment, he lay completely still, every muscle taut. The sound was unmistakable, the clatter of dishes, the rush of a faucet, the soft scrape of ceramic against metal. His first thought was that Michael had gotten out of bed, but no, the sounds were steady, purposeful, too practiced for a child's small hands. His chest tightened. He wanted to believe it was nothing more than his mind, playing tricks born of exhaustion and grief. He told himself that old pipes sometimes made strange noises, that perhaps he'd left a dish in the sink balanced wrong, shifting under its own weight. He told himself everything except the truth that was clawing at the edges of his mind. It sounded exactly like Anna washing the dishes, just as she used to do when the house was quiet and she thought no one noticed. He closed his eyes tightly, clutching the blanket, willing the sound to fade. After a few minutes, the clinking softened, the water stopped, and silence returned. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked steadily, and the house was still once again. David exhaled a shaky breath. It had to be his imagination. It had to be. He couldn't allow himself to believe otherwise. And yet, as sleep finally overtook him again, the scent of lavender, faint but unmistakable, drifted through the living room, settling over him like a whisper from the past. The night pressed heavily against the windows, the kind of stillness that seemed to hold its breath. David had fallen asleep on the couch again, his laptop still open beside him, a half-written email glowing faintly on the screen. The house was silent except for the tick of the clock in the hallway. It was silence he had forced himself to grow used to, but deep down, he never really did. He missed the way Anna's footsteps had once filled it, the way she hummed absent-mindedly when she cooked or cleaned. Silence felt wrong. Silence felt unnatural. And then he heard it again. At first it was faint, so faint that he thought it might be a dream. The sound of water rushing steadily, the light tap-tap of porcelain against stainless steel. Then came the soft clatter of plates, one after another, set carefully into the drying rack. The rhythm was painfully familiar, deliberate, patient, the way Anna had always done it. David's eyes flew open, and his heart immediately began to hammer in his chest. This wasn't his imagination. Not this time. He sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from his shoulders. His breath came shallow, uneven, as he turned his head toward the kitchen. A thin stripe of dim light from the street lamp outside cut across the tiled floor. The rest was shadow. Yet the sounds continued, steady and undeniable. Before he could move, he felt a small presence beside him. Michael stood barefoot in his pajamas, clutching his bear to his chest. His hair was rumpled from sleep, his eyes wide but calm, as if he had been expecting this moment. He tugged gently at David's sleeve and whispered in a voice that sent a chill down his spine, "Daddy, she's still here." David swallowed hard, his throat dry. For a moment he couldn't speak. He wanted to tell Michael it wasn't true, to remind him again that Mommy was gone, but the words refused to form. Instead, he sat frozen, listening to the sounds in the kitchen, the splash of water, the faint hum of a melody. It was Anna's tune, the one she used to hum while standing at that very sink. Gathering courage he wasn't sure he had, David stood, his knees weak, and guided Michael behind him. Step by step, he approached the kitchen doorway, his pulse racing so hard it roared in his ears. The closer he came, the clearer the sounds became, until there was no denying it, someone was there. Someone was washing the dishes. He reached the threshold and froze. The sink faucet was on, water pouring steadily into the basin. A plate rested in the soapy water, suds clinging to its surface, as if it had just been scrubbed by invisible hands. The drying rack held dishes that David was certain he hadn't touched since dinner. And yet there they were, neatly stacked, glistening with water. The humming had stopped the moment he stepped in. The air felt charged, heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. David's gaze darted around the room, but it was empty. The chair was pushed neatly under the table. The countertops gleamed. There was no one there. Behind him, Michael's voice broke the silence again, soft but steady. "She doesn't want us to forget her." The words made David's chest tighten painfully. His eyes burned, though he wasn't sure if it was fear or grief. He wanted to call out her name, to beg for some sign, but the rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible. People didn't come back. The dead didn't linger. And yet, the faucet suddenly shut itself off with a sharp twist of the handle. The sudden stillness was deafening. The scent of lavender floated into the air, faint but distinct, wrapping itself around him like a memory come alive. He turned sharply, half expecting to see her standing behind him, but the doorway was empty except for Michael, who simply stood watching with wide eyes, unafraid. David's hands trembled as he reached for the faucet, twisting it back and forth to reassure himself it wasn't broken. It worked perfectly. The plate in the sink still glistened with fresh suds. He pressed his palm against the counter, steadying himself. His heart was racing, his mind scrambling for explanations, a trick of memory, stress, hallucinations from exhaustion. Anything but the truth that his son seemed to accept so easily. Michael tugged at his pajama sleeve again. "She's happy when we remember her," he said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. David turned to his son, searching his young face for fear, for confusion, for anything that mirrored the turmoil he himself felt. But there was none. Michael's eyes were calm, trusting. To him, this wasn't terrifying. To him, this was just mommy, still taking care of them in the only way she knew how. David crouched down and pulled Michael into his arms, holding him tightly against his chest. His voice shook as he whispered, "I don't know what this is, Mikey. I don't know if it's real. But I promise, we'll never forget her." Michael nodded against his shoulder, his small arms wrapping around his father's neck. The boy didn't say anything more. The kitchen remained quiet now, but the scent lingered. David stood, carrying his son back toward the living room. Every step felt unreal, like walking through a dream that might shatter at any moment. He laid Michael back in bed, tucked him in again, and sat for a while at his side, watching his eyelids flutter shut. The boy fell asleep almost immediately, untroubled, as though comforted by what he had witnessed. David returned to the kitchen one last time before he allowed himself to rest. The dishes sat in the rack, perfectly arranged. The sink was spotless. A bead of water trickled down the side of the plate, catching the dim light before falling soundlessly into the basin. He leaned against the counter, closing his eyes, his hand pressed firmly against the cool tile. He could almost feel her there, just beyond reach, like a shadow brushing against his skin. It should have terrified him. And part of him was terrified. But beneath the fear, beneath the disbelief, something else stirred, something that felt dangerously close to comfort. For the first time since Anna's death, the house didn't feel completely empty. And that thought, as much as it soothed him, was what frightened him most.